Hello YouTube, Poopslag here, and this is TurboFat, an open source puzzle game I'm developing in the Godot engine. You can find a link to the source code at the GitHub page in the description below. And this month I was focused on getting the overworld to look more like I wanted in the final game, adding some hand-drawn assets, some cool little shaders, and visual effects. So without further ado, let me tell you what I've been working on. So here on the left is how the game looked at the end of last October, and here on the right is how I wanted it to look. And there's stuff like this tree and this bush, and these tiles with the goopy overhangs, all that stuff. That was just going to be stuff I'd have to draw, so that was busy work, but nothing that was too hard for me to figure out. The harder part was going to be the way these white ribbons of frosting go around, or the little spongy texture if you zoom in on this cake. That stuff wasn't really tile-based the way I drew it, and I didn't want it repeating every tile or it would look lame. I wanted these to be big, flowing, sort of random ribbons that didn't repeat every tile or that you didn't see the familiar patterns with everywhere you walked. I had no idea what a sensible way was to do that, so I came up with something sort of weird, and let me show you what I did. So the first thing I had to do, which really sucked and it was a lot of work, was drawing all these little goopy sprites by hand for the tiles that you walked around on. I drew the 16 variations for when they're connected up, down, left, or right, so 16 tile auto tiling. And then a few extras because I didn't want the walls that face the player when there's like a big wall of goop. I didn't want it to have a very obvious repetitive pattern. So there's a few variations you can see here where it's just the goop is different but the tile's the same. So where that'll get you if you do that approach is here, where all the tiles connect to each other, but there's these little divots at the corner where it's like these are all connected up, down, left, and right, but there's a little rounded edge seam in the corner between those four tiles. So to fix that, I did the same thing I did for my blocks in my game, like the pieces that you control, which is to have an extra tile for just like the corner of those spots. You'll have the four pieces that connect, and then on a second layer over top of that, just a thing that covers the corner. So that seems really clumsy and kludgy, and I can't find any record of anybody else doing this. But it means that instead of needing like a 48 tile auto tiling to cover all the corner cases, I just use a 16 tile auto tiling and then cover the spots where this corner would go. The other important part that I did is this is how the tiles would look if I drew them correctly and they were like the exact right size. But I extruded the back sides a couple extra pixels, if you can see. It like stretches out just a little bit. And that's every time it connects to the piece behind it, it stretches out a few extra pixels. And that's to get rid of this little seaming effect. This is what happens if you cut the tiles the exact right size, because then when they just line up perfectly, there's still this little extra spot in between that's either darker or lighter opacity. And I really didn't like that approach. I wanted to not have those seams. So extruding them fixed that completely, and there's no seams, and it looks really slick. So I already had this oozing rainbow shader, which I was using for the rainbow frosting, which splashes around in the puzzles, and I adapted that to this caramel goop shader for the overworld. So to get these red and green painted tiles to have textures drawn over them, I created a custom shader. This shader was based on the RGB palette shader, which I was using for my monsters, which would recolor red, green, and blue into new colors like orange, black, and teal, so my monsters could be different colors. However, this time, instead of flat colors, it was using textures. The red parts of the image would be replaced with this brown spongy texture, and the green parts of the image would be replaced with this viewport texture, which had that goopy shader applied to it. I also needed to stretch and move these textures as the camera moved, otherwise the textures would look like they were floating above the world and not panning alongside it. To facilitate that, there's independent scale and offset parameters for each of the three color channels, and these parameters are updated once a frame in this process function. The canvas transform tells us which part of the world is currently visible, and we use that to calculate the appropriate offsets and pass them in as shader parameters. After the earlier bottlenecks I'd encountered setting shader parameters, I was worried this approach might be too slow, but it seems to perform well. So the overworld objects like this tree and bush were pretty straightforward to implement, but I did do something a little clever for the shadows, so let me explain that. The overworld objects which cast shadows are added to the shadow casters group, and they also define an optional shadow scale metadata element. This shadow caster shadows node searches for all nodes in the shadow casters group and creates shadow objects for them. This oval shadow object is responsible for updating the position and scale of each shadow. It's similar to what I did for the creature shadows, except now it can work for any type of object, not just creatures. So here's the result. It looks pretty good. I didn't get to the water, and I also sort of wanted a background so it didn't look like they were just floating in space, but I figure I'll get to that in the coming months. Once again, there's 3 new songs by Pete Ellison of Disco Warp Records. Check them out. almost done, just 2 or 3 more songs. Hope you like what you hear. So I made a post about the game to Reddit, and reception was pretty positive. But the most common complaint was that people didn't like the default controls and they couldn't change them. So firstly, I changed the default controls so that space is hard drop. This is just what people are used to. I also added a second WASD control preset for people who are used to steering the pieces with their left hand. And lastly, a custom tab where you can define your own controls. This is especially important for people using Azerty or Dvorak, where the Z and X keys make absolutely no sense for rotating. And there's some logic to make sure you don't bind the same key to 2 conflicting commands. This code is adapted from ANJ95's Godot Toolbox project, which has a great example of letting the player customize their controls in-game. The resulting controls are exported in JSON alongside all your other save data, and they'll be loaded up next time you play. So yeah, enjoy your custom controls. So that's where we're at after November. The overworld's starting to look a little better, but there's still not much to do out there. I'd like to tackle that next month. Get a little bit more story, develop some characters, you know. Should be a lot of fun. See you guys in December.